This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in February 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 8. The sun was up so high when I waked that I judged it was after 8 o'clock. I laid there in the grass in the cool shade, thinking about things, and feeling rested and rather comfortable and satisfied. I could see the sun out at 1 or 2 holes, but mostly it was big trees all about, and gloomy in there amongst them. There was freckled places on the ground where the light sifted down through the leaves, and the freckled places swapped about a little, showing there was a little breeze up there. A couple of squirrels set on a limb and jabbered at me very friendly. I was powerful lazy and comfortable. Didn't want to get up and cook breakfast. Well, I was dozing off again when I thinks I hear a deep sound of boom away up the river. I rouses up and rests on my elbow and listens. Pretty soon I hears it again. I hopped up and went and looked out at a hole in the leaves, and I see a bunch of smoke layin' on the water a long ways up, about abreast the ferry. And there was the ferry boat, full of people floating along down. I knowed what was the matter now. Boom! I see the white smoke squirt out of the ferry boat's side. You see, they was firing cannon over the water, trying to make my carcass come to the top. I was pretty hungry, but it warn't going to do for me to start a fire, because they might see the smoke. So I set there and watched the cannon smoke and listened to the boom. The river was a mile wide there, and it always looks pretty on a summer morning, so I was having a good enough time seeing them hunt for my remainders if I only had a bite to eat. Well, then I happened to think how they always put quicksilver in loaves of bread and float them off, because they always go right to the drownded carcass and stop there. So, says I, I'll keep a lookout, and if any of them's floating around after me, I'll give them a show. I changed to the Illinois edge of the island to see what luck I could have, and I warn't disappointed. A big double loaf come along, and I most got it with a long stick, but my foot slipped, and she floated out further. Of course I was where the current set in the closest to the shore. I knowed enough for that. But by and by along comes another one, and this time I won. I took out the plug and shook out the little dab of quicksilver and set my teeth in. It was baker's bread, what the quality eat, none of your low-down corn-pone. I got a good place amongst the leaves, and set there on a log, munchin' the bread and watchin' the ferry boat, and very well satisfied. And then something struck me. I says, now I reckon the widow or the parson or somebody prayed that this bread would find me, and here it has gone and done it. So there ain't no doubt but there is something in that. That is, there's something in it when a body like the widow or the parson prays, but it don't work for me, and I reckon it don't work for only just the right kind. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke and went on watchin'. The ferry boat was floatin' with the current, and I allowed I'd have a chance to see who was aboard when she come along, because she would come in close where the bread did. When she got pretty well along down towards me, I put out my pipe and went to where I fished out the bread, and laid down behind a log on the bank in a little open place. Where the log forked, I could peep through. By and by she come along, and she drifted in so close that they could have run out a plank and walked ashore. Most everybody was on the boat. Pap and Judge Thatcher and Bessie Thatcher and Joe Harper and Tom Sawyer and his old Aunt Polly and Sid and Mary and plenty more. Everybody was talking about the murder, but the captain broke in and says, "Look sharp now, the current sets in the closest here, and maybe he's washed ashore and got tangled amongst the brush at the water's edge. I hope so, anyway." I didn't hope so. They all crowded up and leaned over the rails, nearly in my face, and kept still, watchin' with all their might. I could see them first rate, but they couldn't see me. Then the captain sung out, "Stand away!" and the cannon let off such a blast right before me that it made me deaf with the noise and pretty near blind with the smoke, and I judged I was gone. If they'd had some bullets in, I reckon they'd have got the corpse they was after. Well, I see I warn't hurt, thanks to goodness. The boat floated on and went out of sight around the shoulder of the island. I could hear the boomin' now and then, further and further off, and by, after an hour, I didn't hear it no more. The island was 3 mile long. I judged they had got to the foot and was giving it up, but they didn't yet a while. They turned around the foot of the island and started up the channel on the Missouri side, under steam and boomin' once in a while as they went. I crossed over to that side and watched them. When they got abreast the head of the island, they quit shootin' and dropped over to the Missouri shore and went home to the town. I knowed I was all right now. Nobody else would come a-huntin' after me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made me a nice camp in the thick woods. I made a kind of tent out of my blankets to put my things under so the rain couldn't get at them. I catched a catfish and haggled him open with my saw, and towards sundown I started my campfire and had supper. Then I set out a line to catch some fish for breakfast. When it was dark, I set by my campfire smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied. But by, it got sort of lonesome, and so I went and set on the bank and listened to the current swashing along and counted the stars and drift logs and rafts that come down, and then went to bed. There ain't no better way to put in time when you are lonesome. You can't stay so, you soon get over it. And so for 3 days and nights, no difference, just the same thing. But the next day I went exploring around down through the island. I was boss of it. It all belonged to me, so to say, and I wanted to know all about it. But mainly I wanted to put in the time. I found plenty strawberries ripe and prime, and green summer grapes and green raspberries, and the green blackberries was just beginning to show. They would all come handy by and by, I judged. Well, I went fooling along in the deep woods, till I judged I warn't far from the foot of the island. I had my gun along, but I hadn't shot nothing. It was for protection. Thought I would kill some game nigh home. About this time I mighty near stepped on a good-sized snake, and it went sliding off through the grass and flowers, and I after it, trying to get a shot at it. I clipped along, and all of a sudden I bounded right onto the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking. My heart jumped up amongst my lungs. I never waited for to look further, but uncocked my gun and went sneaking back on my tiptoes as fast as ever I could. Every now and then I stopped a second amongst the thick leaves and listened, but my breath come so hard I couldn't hear nothing else. I slunk along another piece further, then listened again, and so on and so on. If I see a stump, I took it for a man. If I trod on a stick and broke it, it made me feel like a person had cut one of my breaths in two, and I only got half, and the short half, too. When I got to camp, I warn't feeling very brash. There warn't much sand in my craw, but I says, this ain't no time to be fooling around. So I got all my traps into my canoe again, so as to have them out of sight, and I put out the fire and scattered the ashes around to look like an old last year's camp, and then clumb a tree. I reckon I was up in the tree 2 hours, but I didn't see nothing. I didn't hear nothing. I only thought I heard and seen as much as 1,000 things. Well, I couldn't stay up there forever, so at last I got down, but I kept in the thick woods and on the lookout all the time. All I could get to eat was berries, and what was left over from breakfast. By the time it was night, I was pretty hungry, so when it was good and dark, I slid out from shore before moonrise and paddled over to the Illinois bank, about 1/4 of a mile. I went out in the woods and cooked a supper, and I had about made up my mind I would stay there all night, when I hear it plunkety-plunk, plunkety-plunk, and says to myself, horses comin', and next I hear people's voices. I got everything into the canoe as quick as I could, and then went creeping through the woods to see what I could find out. I hadn't got far when I hear a man say, "We better camp here if we can find a good place. The horses is about beat out. Let's look around." I didn't wait, but shoved out and paddled away easy. I tied up in the old place and reckoned I would sleep in the canoe. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't, somehow, for thinking. And every time I waked up, I thought somebody had me by the neck, so the sleep didn't do me no good. By and by, I says to myself, I can't live this way. I'm a-going to find out who it is that's here on the island with me. I'll find it out or bust. Well, I felt better right off. So I took my paddle and slid out from shore just a step or two, and then let the canoe drop along down amongst the shadows. The moon was shining, and outside of the shadows it made it most as light as day. I poked along well on to an hour, everything still as rocks and sound asleep. Well, by this time I was most down to the foot of the island. A little ripply, cool breeze begun to blow, and that was as good as sayin' the night was about done. I give her a turn with a paddle and brung her nose to shore. Then I got my gun and slipped out and into the edge of the woods. I sat down there on a log and looked out through the leaves. I see the moon go off watch, and the darkness begin to blanket the river. But in a little while I see a pale streak over the tree-tops, and knowed the day was comin'. So I took my gun and slipped off towards where I had run across that campfire, stoppin' every minute or two to listen. But I hadn't no luck somehow. I couldn't seem to find the place. But by and by, sure enough, I catched a glimpse of fire away through the trees. I went for it, cautious and slow. By and by, I was close enough to have a look, and there laid a man on the ground. It most give me the fantods. He had a blanket round his head, and his hand was nearly in the fire. I set there behind a clump of bushes in about 6 foot of him, and kept my eyes on him steady. It was gettin' gray daylight now. Pretty soon he gapped and stretched himself and hove off the blanket, and it was Miss Watson's Jim. I bet I was glad to see him. I says, "Hello, Jim," and skipped out. He bounced up and stared at me wild. Then he drops down on his knees and puts his hand together and says, "Don't hurt me, don't. I ain't never done no harm to a ghost. I always liked dead people, and done all I could for 'em. You go and get in the river again what you belongs, and don't do nothing to old Jim. I was always your friend." Well, I warn't long making him understand I warn't dead. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I warn't lonesome now. I told him I warn't afraid of him telling the people where I was. I talked along, but he only set there and looked at me, never said nothing. Then I says, "It's good daylight, let's get breakfast. Make up your campfire good." "What's the use of making up the campfire to cook strawberries on sich truck? But you got a gun, hain't you? Then we can get something better than strawberries." "Strawberries in such truck," I says. "Is that what you live on?" "I couldn't get nothing else," he says. "Why, how long you been on the island, Jim?" "I come here the night after you's killed." "What, all that time?" "Yes, indeedy." "And you hain't had nothing but that kind of rubbish to eat?" "No, sah, nothing else." "Well, you must be most starved, ain't you?" "I reckon I could eat a hoss. I think I could." "How long you been on the island?" "Since the night I got killed." "No! Why, what has you lived on? But you got a gun. Oh, yes, you got a gun. That's good. Now you kill something, and I'll make up the fire." So we went over to where the canoe was, and while he built a fire in a grassy open place amongst the trees, I fetched meal and bacon and coffee pot and frying pan and sugar and tin cups, and the nigger was set back considerable, because he reckoned it was all done with witchcraft. I catched a good big catfish, too, and Jim cleaned him with his knife and fried him. When breakfast was ready, we lolled on the grass and eat it smoking hot. Jim laid it in with all his might, for he was most about starved. Then when he had got pretty well stuffed, we laid off and lazied. By and by, Jim says, "But looky here, Huck, who was it Dad was killed in that shanty if it warn't you?" Then I told him the whole thing, and he said it was smart. He said Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. Then I says, "How do you come to be here, Jim, and how'd you get here?" He looked pretty uneasy and didn't say nothing for a minute. Then he says, "Maybe I better not tell." "Why, Jim?" "Well, they's reasons. But you wouldn't tell on me if I was to tell you, would you, Huck?" "Blamed if I would, Jim." "Well, I believe you, Huck. I run off." "Jim!" "But mind, you said you wouldn't tell. You know you said you wouldn't tell, Huck." "Well, I did. I said I wouldn't, and I'll stick to it. Honest Injun, I will. People would call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for keeping mum, but that don't make no difference. I ain't a-going to tell, and I ain't a-going back there anyways, so now let's know all about it." "Well, you see, it was this way. Ol' Missus, that's Miss Watson, she pecks on me all the time and treats me pooty rough, and she always says she wouldn't sell me down to Orleans. But I noticed they was a nigger trader round the place considerable lately, and I begin to get uneasy. Well, one night I creeps to the door pooty late, and it don't want quite shut, and I hear Ol' Missus tell the widder she gwine to sell me to Orleans, but she didn't want to, but she could get $800 for me, and it is such a big stack of money she couldn't resist. De widder, she tried to get her to say she wouldn't do it, but I never waited to hear the rest. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. I tuck out and shin down de hill and spect to steal a skift along de show somewheres above de town, but dey was people a-stirrin' yit, so I hid in de old tumble-down copper shop on de bank to wait for everybody to go away. Well, I was dere all night. Dey was somebody round all de time. 'Long 'bout 6 in de mornin', skifts begun to go by, and 'bout 8 or 9, every skift that went long was talkin' 'bout how yo' pap come over to town and says you's killed. Dese last skifts was full of ladies and gentlemen a-goin' over for to see de place. Sometimes dey'd pull up at de shore and take a rest before dey started across. So by de talk I got to know all about de killin'. I was powerful sorry you's killed, Huck, but I ain't no mo' now. I laid there under the shavin's all day. I was hungry, but I warn't afeared, because I knowed ol' missus and de widder was goin' to start to de camp meetin' right after breakfast and be gone all day, and dey knows I goes off wid de cattle 'bout daylight, so dey wouldn't 'spect to see me round de place, and so dey wouldn't miss me till after dark in de evenin'. De other servants wouldn't miss me, 'cause dey'd shin out and take holiday soon as de ol' folks is outen de way. Well, when it come dark I tuck out up de river road and went 'bout 2 miles or more to get where dey warn't no houses. I'd made up my mind 'bout what I's a-gwine to do. You see, if I kep' on tryin' to get away afoot, de dogs 'd track me. If I stole a skift to cross over, dey'd miss dat skift, you see, and dey'd know about where I land on de other side, and where to pick up my track. So I says, a raft is what I's after. It don't make no track. I see a light a-comin' round de point by, so I wade in and shove a log ahead of me and swum more'n halfway across de river and got in 'mongst de driftwood and kep' my head down low and kinder swum against de current till de raft come along. Den I swum to de stern of it and tuck a holt. It clouded up and it was pretty dark for a little while, so I clumb up and laid down on de planks. De men is all way yonder in de middle, where de lantern was. De river was a-risin', and dey was a good current, so I reckoned that by 4 in de mornin' I'd be 25 mile down de river, and den I'd slip in just before daylight and swim ashore and take to de woods on de Illinois side. But I didn't have no luck. When we was most down to de head of the island, a man began to come aft with de lantern. I see it weren't no use for to wait, so I slid overboard and struck out for de island. Well, I had a notion I could land most anywheres, but I couldn't. Bank too bluff. I was most to de foot of de island before I found a good place. I went into de woods and jegged I wouldn't fool wid rafts no more, long as they moved they lantern round so. I had my pipe and a plugger dog leg and some matches in my cap, and they warn't wet, so I was all right. And so you ain't had no meat nor bread to eat all this time? Why didn't you get mud turkles? How you goin' to get 'em? You can't slip up on 'em and grab 'em, and how's a body goin' to hit 'em wid a rock? How could a body do it in de night? And I warn't goin' to show myself on de bank in daytime. Well, that's so. You've had to keep in the woods all the time, of course. Did you hear 'em shootin' the cannon? Oh, yes, I knowed dey was arter you. I see 'em go by here, watched 'em through de bushes. Some young birds come along, flyin' a yard or two at a time and lightin'. Jim said it was a sign it was goin' to rain. He said it was a sign when young chickens flew that way, and so he reckoned it was the same way when young birds done it. I was goin' to catch some of them, but Jim wouldn't let me. He said it was death. He said his father laid mighty sick once, and some of them catched a bird, and his old granny said his father would die, and he did. And Jim said you mustn't count the things you are going to cook for dinner, because that would bring bad luck. The same if you shook the tablecloth after sundown. And he said if a man owned a beehive and that man died, the bees must be told about it before sunup the next morning, or else the bees would all weaken down and quit work and die. Jim said bees wouldn't sting idiots, but I didn't believe that because I had tried them lots of times myself, and they wouldn't sting me. I had heard about some of these things before, but not all of them. Jim knowed all kinds of signs. He said he knowed most everything. I said it looked to me like all the signs was about bad luck, so I asked him if there weren't any good luck signs. He says, "Mighty few, and dey ain't no use to a body. What you want to know when good luck's a-comin' for? Want to keep it off?" And he said, "If you's got hairy arms and a hairy breast, it's a sign dat you's a-gwine to be rich. Well, dey's some use in a sign like dat, 'cause it's so fur ahead. You see, maybe you's got to be po' a long time first, and so you might get discouraged and kill yourself if you didn't know by the sign that you gwine to be rich by and by. Have you got hairy arms and a hairy breast, Jim? What's the use to ask that question? Don't you see I has? Well, are you rich? No, but I been rich once, and I gwine to be rich again. Once I had $14, but I took to speculating and got busted out. What did you speculate in, Jim? Well, first I tackled stock. What kind of stock? Why, livestock, cattle, you know. I put $10 in a cow, but I ain't gwine to risk no mo' money in stock. The cow up and died on my hands. So you lost the $10? No, I didn't lose it all. I only lost about 9 of it. I sold a hide and taller for $1.10. You had $1.10 left. Did you speculate any more? Yes, you know that one-legged nigger that belongs to old Mr. Bradish? Well, he set up a bank and say anybody that put in $1 would get $4 more at the end of the year. Well, all the niggers went in, but they didn't have much. I was the only one to have much. So I stuck out for more'n $4, and I said if I didn't get it, I'd start a bank myself. Well, of course that nigger want to keep me out of the business because he says there weren't business enough for 2 banks. So he said I could put in my $5, and he pay me $35 at the end of the year. So I done it. Then I reckon I'd invest the $35 right off and keep things a-movin'. They was a nigger named Bob that had catched a wood flat, and his marster didn't know it, and I bought it off'n him and told him to take the $35 when the end of the year come, but somebody stole the wood flat that night, and next day the one-legged nigger said the bank's busted, so they didn't none of us get no money. What did you do with the 10 cents, Jim? Well, I was going to spend it, but I had a dream, and the dream told me to give it to a nigger named Balaam. Balaam's ass, they call him for short. He's one of them chuckleheads, you know, but he's lucky, they say, and I see I warn't lucky. The dream says let Balaam invest the 10 cents, and he'd make a raise for me. Well, Balaam, he took the money, and when he was in church, he heard the preacher say that whoever give to the poor, lend to the Lord, and bound to give his money back 100 times. So Balaam, he took and give the 10 cents to the poor, and laid low to see what was gwine to come of it. Well, what did come of it, Jim? Nothing never came of it. I couldn't manage to collect that money no way, and Balaam he couldn't. I ain't gwine to lend no more money thout I see the security. Bound to get your money back 100 times, the preacher says. If I could get the 10 cents back, I'd call it square, and be gladder to chanced. Well, it's all right anyway, Jim, long as you're going to be rich again sometime or other. Yes, and I's rich now, come to look at it. I owns myself, and I's worth $800. I wished I had the money. I wouldn't want no more. End of chapter 8.